into the chat. Thank you to whoever did that. Just to make sure that everybody here knows who we're in this space with. And also, as mentioned, we have interpretation in Spanish and French and obviously English. So you can click the globe button at the bottom of the screen that says interpretation. It might be under 3 dots that say more, and then click whatever is your preferred language. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We can go to the next slide, please. Oh, there you go. Everybody, we'll take a moment so everybody can take a look at that. Wonderful. So welcome back to the Unlearning Labs. We've had a hiatus from these calls during the busy last few months, but we have restarted them, and we are going to be continuing with our series on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This series is looking at how to reimagine MEL, or monitoring, evaluation, and learning, with a CLD lens. How can processes be more participatory and more owned by the communities themselves? We're going to do a recap on that series and what we've done so far, just to reorient all of us in it. But first, I'm going to just remind us all what the Unlearning Labs are. The Unlearning Labs are a shared learning space where we work together to strengthen the technical skills that we use to lead organizations and programs with communities, and specifically how to strengthen them by making them more community-led. Our goal is to unlearn top-down practices and relearn them in a more community-led way. We do this over a series of calls. Some are longer and some are shorter. There's different topics for different series, and these have been decided by members. We had one on strategic planning and how to do that with communities. We're now in this CoMEL, or community-led or CLD adjacent monitoring, evaluation, and learning series. And some of the topics that have been identified for future Unlearning Labs are gender responsive budgeting and action research. And if there are other ideas that come, please let us know. We're always interested to collect them and gather feedback from people. But a critical part of the Unlearning Labs is that we're also trying to imagine how these kinds of technical workshops are done in general. Like a lot of other things in our sector, they've traditionally been very top-down and outside-in, where external experts come in and tell us and all of you how to do things in our own contexts. But the Unlearning Labs are founded on the knowledge that we are all teachers and we are all learners, and that there's already a tremendous amount of expertise within our community. We might not all have certificates or diplomas in specific topics, or use very technical, sort of inaccessible language, but we have deep experience working with communities and in our own countries and regions and communities, and designing programs and advocating for change. And so we've probably done a lot of these kinds of processes, even if we call them something different. So that's what we really want to be learning from in the Unlearning Labs. They're participatory spaces where people from our community facilitate, share examples, lessons, and we're co-creating tools and approaches and working together to adapt some of these processes in development at large. In fact, with this CoMEL series that we're doing, we're aiming to build a guide which is shaped by the stories and lessons from all of you on how to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning in a more CLD way. And we're collecting inputs from everyone. We have a survey for those who'd like to contribute. Again, it doesn't matter if you call it MEL, or monitoring, evaluation, learning, or CoMEL, or not. And we'll share the links to that later on in the call. And if you ever want to help lead or facilitate an Unlearning Lab, also let us know. Okay, so back to this series on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This is the 6th call in this series. The first one was just on monitoring, evaluation, and learning generally, giving all of us a foundation in some of the key language and logic of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. The second one was on CoMEL, CLD adjacent monitoring, evaluation, and learning specifically, and looking at it broadly and how it's different from other approaches to MEL and why we use it. And then we started going into the evaluation cycle itself and digging into each phase of that. So we started with a call on how to craft a theory of change with communities. That was led by our colleagues from MCLD Kenya and the Hunger Project Mexico, Steve Ogutu and Sylvia Hernandez. And then we had one on identifying learning questions and indicators with communities, which was facilitated by Ronald Kimambo from the Firelight Foundation in Tanzania. And the most recent one we had was with Outreach International and Outreach Philippines on working with communities to collect data. Today, we're going to hear from Joy Mukoma, who leads research and training on monitoring and evaluation with the UN Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. And she works also specifically on decolonizing MEL and participatory MEL and community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And so she'll be guiding us to, as we think through how to analyze the data, after we've collected the data, after we've, after the communities have decided what are the indicators and the questions, how do we understand the data with communities so that it's them, the communities themselves, that are unpacking the lessons learned about interventions, who are identifying the themes, the trends, the patterns that are really relevant to their context and to their priorities. And then we'll have one final session in that evaluation cycle, which will be later this month. We'll give the date later, with One Village Partners in Sierra Leone. So I'm going to hand it over to Gunjan in just a minute, and she's going to take us through those calls and just remind us what we've learned so far in them. But as I pass it to her, I'm curious to hear from people on the call if you've attended any of the previous calls in this series. What is something that you remember or that you learned or stood out? It can be anything. It can be about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or it can just be about these spaces or something that happened during that time. So please just type that in the chat. We'd be really curious to hear. And with that, Gunjan, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Nellie, and welcome everyone. We'll give everybody a minute or so to put things in chat just to see if you have attended any of the Unlearning Labs and if you remember anything or anything stood out, or if there was anything that you left with, I wanted to know more about this. So we'll just give everybody a minute if people want to just put something in chat. In whatever language you are comfortable with. We are having 3 working languages today: English, French, and Spanish. So thank you, Annette. Annette is talking about how in so many instances, the international affairs way of doing MEL is irrelevant, not well understood, and needs to be reconstructed in a more useful way by CLD practitioners. Yep, and that's kind of also the overall goal of our calls here, to see that how do we make sure that we are applying a community-led lens to any kind of monitoring and evaluation activities that we undertake. Francis is talking about how to involve the community during MEL activities. Yes. Great. Please keep putting any learnings or anything that you remember from the series in the chat box. We will move ahead just because as we've always seen in the Unlearning Labs calls, it doesn't matter that we have 2 hours together. They go by very swiftly. because not only are we trying to unpack some of these topics, we are actually trying to co-create ways of doing them through a community-led lens. And that does require a little bit of time. So I'm going to move ahead with it. If we can move to the next slide, please, Cassidy. So as Nelly said, we started the series on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning with a couple of quick introductory sessions on what is MEL and what is CoMEL. And the idea for us is that typically monitoring, evaluation, and learning has been a very extractive process. It's been a process wherein an organization or a funder commissions people or themselves go to a community and get information from them to find out answers to questions that they deem are important, whether it is, well, how useful was the money that we sent out? What impact did it have? Or why did the program work or not work, right? Whereas for CoMEL, one of the fundamental principles, at least as we see it in the movement, is it's data of the people, by the people, and for the people. So it is a collaboration between the community and an implementing organization. If you're familiar with the movement, you know that we've always maintained in the movement that we require all stakeholders to transform our system and to create the world that we would like to see, right? But all of us have a space and place in that system. What we want to address through the work that we all do together is the power dynamics that are present in the system. And for CoMEL, one of the foundational principles is that we move that power, which is traditionally rested in traditional MEL, with the funder, with the external evaluator, with the implementing organization or the NGO. We shift that, we change that, we flip that, and we recognize that actually the power has to be with the communities, and that any kind of MEL practice, which is super important, right? Because learning is important in the work that we do. But that learning is centered around what the community needs and wants. So it's based on the community first principle. And there are three underlying principles when we talk of CoMEL. Ownership. So we talk about who owns the data, how is it used, and where is decided not by a funder, not by somebody external, but we recognize that it is the community who owns that data. It doesn't mean that we cannot share it outside. We can all learn from that. But that sharing has to be with the permission of the owners of that data, which is the community, and in partnership with them. Voice, whose voices are heard and valued, not just during the evaluation process, right? So it's not just about who we are speaking to during the data collection phase, but whose voices are heard and valued in terms of what is success for us? How are we measuring that success? And then finally, power. It all comes down to, as I said at the beginning, the question of power. So if you're familiar with the power cube, there are different types of power that we talk about. And traditional MEL has often been an exercise of power over. Somebody has power over the communities and is exercising it to demand accountability or to check whether they have done what we wanted them to do. So it's almost sitting in judgment. It's power over. Whereas community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning is all about power with, power within, and power to, right? So it's recognizing the power in communities. If you can go to the next slide, please. So in our first call, what we did was we tried to unpack what MEL is, because many of us believe that MEL is a very niche, specialized field, right? And it requires expertise to do it. There are all these fancy terms and jargon and methods, process tracing, randomized controlled trials, and we are all trying to make sense of what these words mean. And we feel like, oh my God, we don't know what it is. But as Nelly said, for us, this space, the Unlearning Labs, is actually recognizing that we actually all have knowledge and experiences within ourselves that we can pool together to co-create something together. So in the first session we were looking at unpacking some of the basic terminology. that is used in MEL. And two things that I want to flag from here, actually, even before I go to those two, just a very quick overview of what we be talking of when we said monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring is essentially, are we doing what we said we would do, right? It's something that's a continuous process throughout the program when we are checking in and seeing, are we doing what we said we'll do? And evaluation is really where we are saying, well, if we are doing what we said we would do, is it giving us the results? Are we seeing the impact that we thought would happen by doing this? If yes, great. Why? How? What are the factors? If not, why not? Right? So both of these are essentially in CoMEL, and this is the important part. In CoMEL, both monitoring and evaluations are tools not just of accountability. These are tools for learning, right? And so one of the things that often comes up when people talk of MEL is the type of data. Because to learn, we need information. Information comes in the form of data. Information and data can be of two types, qualitative or quantitative. And that's what we had done in the first session. Quantitative data, what you can measure, what you can count, right? Often associated with numbers. Qualitative data, something much more descriptive. So it's talking about the hows and the whys of things. If we go to the next slide, we also in that first session went into a lot of things like what is a logic model, the logic process, terms like outcomes, outputs, which we are actually not going to go over quickly now. This is just a refresher that we had done all of this. If we can do a few rapid clicks, Cassidy, we will come to what we're going to tackle now, which is what is the difference between traditional MEL and community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And one of the key things, as I said, again, let's do a few rapid clicks, Cassidy, till we come to the CoMEL slide. Thank you. One of the things that we did talk about was that it's not extractive, right? The second thing that we said, which is important about CoMEL, is that it's based on a community-first principle. Now we use, thank you, Cassidy, this is the right slide. We use a number of different terms interchangeably, though they are not the same. Community-led MEL, participatory MEL, empowerment evaluation, if you're from the evaluation field. We also talk about CLD congruent evaluation. CLD congruent evaluation for us is evaluation which aligns with the principles of community-led development, but does not necessarily work with a community-first lens. So it engages communities, it's closer to participatory MEL, but it doesn't really center them as the key actors. In community-led MEL, we actually center the community. Both of these processes, be it community-led MEL or CLD congruent MEL, have three basic characteristics. First, it's community-driven, so it's practical and relevant, right? It is about what community members want to learn. It's action-oriented. It's not done to do a report, which is sitting somewhere in your office, or to satisfy the needs of a funder. It's done because you want to learn and you immediately take action to move things so that you can actually see the change you want to see. And it's participatory. Next slide, please. What we did in one of our very first calls was, so you'll see slides in different languages. We can skip this. I don't think we really need to make a case for CoMEL with this group here, so we can move directly to the CoMEL cycle slide. Thank you, Cassidy. If you can do a few clicks so that we see the full cycle. One of the first things we did in the, that's it, thank you, in this series of calls was look at, so what does community-led MEL look like if we look at the cycle of activities that happen in monitoring and evaluation, right? And specifically in evaluation. So the cycle that we have is that we start with first coming up with a theory of change, right? Which is nothing but what what is our pathway towards the change we want to see? That's your theory of change. How do you think the actions you take, the inputs, the activities are all going to lead to the outcomes, the impact that we would like to see? That's your theory of change. It's a pathway towards the goal that we want to see. Then we look at what are our learning questions, which is nothing but what is it that we want to learn from doing the evaluation, right? What does success look like to us? So that's your first step, defining. The second step is that once we know what our learning questions are, we begin to look at what does success look like, which is nothing but deciding what the indicators are, because your indicators are measures of success, right? And then how are we going to find out whether or not we have succeeded? And those are the methods. Those is like what data will you collect and how will you collect that data? Then we analyze this. Okay, now what is this data telling us? And validate it, which is, well, is what we think the data is telling us, is this actually what the data is telling us, right? That's validation. Finally, because community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning is about action, we go back to the community and we try and understand if this is what we have learned, what changes are needed, what action do we need to take, and who needs to take it. And finally, making sure that the broader community knows not just what the learnings were from the process, but also what actions were decided and why and how they would be taken. So these steps typically, well, not the last two so much, but the first three steps of defining, collecting, and analyzing are actually part of a traditional MEL process, right? The difference is in community-led MEL, it is the community which is a part of each one of these processes. So the community is not just about data collection, which is what happens in traditional MEL when you treat community as sources of data, right? But in CoMEL, the community is part of drafting your theory of change. The community is part of defining what success is and how would they know if something is successful, right? They're also part of deciding how data is collected because you may not know how to reach the teenage mothers in the village because they are ostracized, but the community would know and they would be able to tell you, you know what? At noon, when nobody else is there, they go to the water point to get water. And that would probably be a good place to meet them, right? So you design the process with them. And then you go to them. And this is what we are going to talk about in today's call. Not just to be like, okay, this is what we heard. Does it make sense to you? But actually, we go and ask, well, this is what the data is saying to us. What do you think this means? Why is this happening? What can you tell us about it? And how do we make sense of it together? Right? So that for us is how we define the community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning process. If we go to the next slide, please. So in each of those calls, as Nelly mentioned, we have had 3 calls which have delved into different parts of the CoMEL process. So for the theory of change, we talked about, well, we're used to doing theory of change with our teams. How do we create a theory of change with the community, right? And it's actually, there's this project that I know the Hunger Project and the World Vision teams are doing in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh. It's a USAID funded project in which we actually did theory building with the community. And the first reaction that all the teams had when they came back from that workshop was, oh my God, this is so simple. Why have we not done it before? Because all that meant was we were asking the communities the same questions that we ask ourselves in many ways when we are drafting a theory of change. Okay, what is the problem? What is the issue that we want to address, right? Who are the people involved that we need to reach with this issue? What kind of steps can we take? Why do we think taking these steps will make a difference? What's it going to do? And what is that difference that we will see at the end of the day if we do these steps? And if you do that together, then what you get is a theory of change. And then the role of any of us, right, as community-based organizations, local organizations, NGOs, international organizations, is really just about putting that data together into a written or a visual format that makes sense for us and that gives us what we often see, the fancy theory of change diagrams then. The next slide, please. The next thing we went into was to say that, okay, what are these learning questions? Because typically, any evaluation, we have learning questions, but as many of us know, these learning questions are defined by the funder very often, or by us when we say that, okay, so this was the purpose of our intervention. Based on this purpose, what is our learning question, right? Because a learning question is nothing but an inquiry into what is it that we want to understand more or get more information on. What do we want to learn more about? But in community-led projects, it is the communities who are deciding what needs to be done and how, right? And if that is the case, then they should be the ones who should also be deciding, well, where do we need more information? What are the gaps that we have? Or what do we want to know more about? So that was the session that we did on learning questions and how do we frame learning questions. Next slide, please. In all of this, the important thing, if you remember, that we have said throughout all of these calls has always been that you can't do CoMEL for a top-down project, really. It doesn't make sense because if the community doesn't even know what was done and why it's being done and what is expected, and they're not part of that process, how do we expect them to decide what success will be like or how you should reach people and what you should measure? So the one thing to keep in mind is that CoMEL or CLD congruent MEL only comes into play for CLD programs, right? Then we talked about indicators. We had a whole session with Ronald on indicators, which again is a place which seems very daunting to many of us who are not from a MEL background, right? Because it's all of these things like U5MR, which is nothing but under 5 mortality rate. How many children under the age of 5 are actually dying, right? Within a specific period per a section of the population. But we hear all the jargon and the community will obviously not know this jargon. But if we understand what indicators are, which is nothing but measures of success, right? How are we measuring success? If that is what indicators are, then communities are actually very well placed to help you identify them. And one of the examples we discussed, if anybody remembers, is this case from Guatemala, when there was a community in Guatemala where they were asked, what is it that you would like to address? And the women all said, well, you know what? Our children are dying of hunger. So we want to have food security interventions. They wanted to have measures to address that. Great. So then they were asked, well, how would you measure success? And they said, it's very simple. We'll go and count our children's graves. If the number of graves has gone down, we know we are good, right? Now you can then, as an external evaluator or whatever, you can say, okay, so they want to look at infant mortality, they want to look at under 5 mortality or whatever. But the community can tell you what success will look like. And that's what we did in that session. How do we then do this with communities? What are some of the indigenous ways of also looking at indicators? Next slide. The last thing that we did before I hand over to Joyce here is we had a team from Outreach Philippines and Outreach International talk about the process they used, right, to do community-led monitoring and evaluation. And this is something we are incredibly proud of because this is the first time, and that's the slide that you see. This is the first time in our knowledge that a journal published an article with the community as the first author. So we all know how difficult and how impenetrable a lot of the journals and this whole structure and industry of publishing is, where you need to be a PhD, you need to do things in a certain way to get published. we managed the article that you see here and that outreach team talked about, because the Outreach Philippines team facilitated this process, was how this community in the Philippines had done their own evaluation and monitoring process and written an article to share their learnings, which was then published in a journal. So, next slide. So when it comes to data collection, again, one of the key questions we ask ourselves is, what kind of data do we need to collect? Is it the numbers, right? So how many? How much? So are we talking about numbers, right? How many children died, right? How many women went to the health center? Or are we talking about more descriptive data, right? So what did the women experience when they went to the health center that made them decide we should or should not come there, right? Oftentimes in evaluations, we hear mixed methods, which is we are using both quantitative numbers as well as qualitative, which is descriptive information which comes from interviews, conversations with a group when we have a specific set of questions, what is called focus group discussions. Conversations with individuals, what we call key informant interviews, right? So we all have technical names for all of these things, but that's what this is. If we go to the next slide. So in that session, we covered a little bit about how do you identify which method do you use? Because there is a whole, and I know we have a lot of evaluators here also today. And we all know there's a whole set of evaluation methods, from photo voice to outcome harvesting, outcome mapping, process tracing, RCTs. There's no dearth of methods that we have out there, right? But when we break it down, they just come down to certain approaches. They're very logical. The thing with MEL, and the reason why we think it should be so accessible, is it's very logical. It's common sense in many ways. Common sense which has been given a language to it. So we spoke specifically to a kind of method which is photo voice, which is about taking a photo in response to an action and then thinking about how are people interpreting the world based on that photographs together, right? Next slide. And I think that may probably be one of my last slides.
I think this is the last slide.
Okay, fantastic. So that was a little long, but I just wanted to walk us through everything that we have done together as a reminder, because now Joyce is going to take us to the next step in the process, which is about, okay, so now you've done all of this with the community. We've created the theory of change with them or identified learning questions with them. We've decided what data should be collected with them. We've gone and collected that data. So now we have all of this data. Now what? What do we do with this? And does the community have a role in this stage of the process? So Joy, over to you to help us think about some of these questions.
Thank you, Gunjan, and thank you, Nelly. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Okay. And I hope you can all see it. So thank you for the very lovely introduction, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to engage in such meaningful conversations. So for today, I'll be guiding you through a journey into community-led data analysis, starting with a clear understanding of what we mean by data and data analysis, and then setting the stage to explore how it can be uniquely undertaken within a community-led framework. So I'll get right into it. So what is data? Just right from the start, what is data? Data is information, and this information can be in different forms. It can be in the form of numbers, what we call quantitative data, as Gunjan has mentioned, or it can be in the form of words or text or stories, or what we all know as qualitative data. It can be observations or any information collected to understand a phenomenon. So data is essential in making decisions and understanding trends or gaining insights. So, but data, as we may know, in itself, it has no meaning. And to make it meaningful and get results, it needs to be fast analyzed. And that's where we talk of data analysis. We are organizing, we're tabulating, we're summarizing the data, we're comparing these results, and we're presenting it in a manner that is meaningful to us. So the analysis process involves this identification process. You identify the categories of responses that you have found in your data, and then you sift it to obtain significant pieces of information, and then having a deliberation process or a dialogue process, either with yourself or with stakeholders that are involved, so that you can extract meaningful information from it. But the idea is that we don't just stop at the analysis, which involves breaking down and examining the data. We need to move forward into generating richer insights and having grounded conclusions that allow us to establish explanations and lessons for decision-making. So once we break down this data in the analysis process, is when you can now move on to synthesize this data, where we're combining the different pieces of data that we have broken down to generate a comprehensive understanding and create a broader picture. For example, if you're dealing with a project that's working on insecurity, then you'll ask yourself, what is the correlation between the data you have on, say, unemployment and crime rates in a region, for example? And this then allows us to move to the interpretation, where now we're seeking to make sense of this data before us. And you're asking ourselves, what does these findings that we have from this data, what do they imply to us in the context of our research or our programs that we are undertaking? So as mentioned, these types of data that you have can be quantitative or qualitative. And depending on the type of data you have, it determines the type of data analysis you will undertake. So as mentioned, quantitative data describes situations in numerical formats. For example, you can have a percentage of the population that is unemployed. And it can be whole numbers, it can be percentages, it can be ratios or frequencies. But at the center of quantitative data is that it employs statistical tools and models in its analysis. And some examples of these methods of quantitative data analysis are listed here on the screen, like such as descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, cluster analysis, which will not go bit by bit at this stage. I will invite you to take a look at these methods at your own time. Also, the data can be qualitative. Again, as mentioned here, it describes a situation in the form of text, ideas, or words, or stories which are collected from participants and different stakeholders that are involved so that they can describe situations in their own words. Now, there are many methods of qualitative data analysis. Some focus on the themes presented in the text or words, and others try to disentangle the hidden patterns of meaning that are emerging. Again, I listed some examples of qualitative data analysis, such as thematic analysis, narrative analysis, discourse analysis, each seeking to cover means of analyzing these different stories or words that we have. And again, I will not get deep into these types of methods because that's not the focus today, but I invite you to look at this at your own time. Or you can have mixed methods, as Gunjan had mentioned, where you combine now these qualitative and quantitative methods of data analysis, so you can make sense of your data. Now, regardless of which method you choose, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, at the center of it all is to be able to systematically interpret your data in a way that not only highlights your program's impacts, but also provides a basis for ongoing learning. So we seek to address various questions at this stage, such as what is this data telling you? What surprises you about this data? Does this lead to any new questions? You can have several guiding questions when you conduct your data analysis around the relevance and context of your program, the key findings and patterns, and the challenges and risks. What you need to do, the main aspect of it all is that you are able to lead yourself to draw meaningful conclusions and insights that align with the objectives you've set before you. So, with all that we have mentioned, how does then this apply to community-led data analysis? What is community-led data analysis? So community-led data analysis is embedded in qualitative data analysis. This is because, just similarly to qualitative data analysis, it emphasizes the understanding and the interpretation of context-specific meanings, the stories, the narratives, the themes, and this is all central to the qualitative data analysis aspect. So the goal in community-led data analysis is to dig into local perspectives and lived experiences. Community-led data analysis is inherently participatory because it directly involves the community members in the interpretation process. And this empowers the community to shape findings and determine their own priorities. So it goes beyond just consulting the community members because it places them in an active role where they can discuss, they can validate, and they can draw their own conclusions from the data that impacts them directly. And placing them in this active role then allows us to shift the power dynamics in the project or the program or the intervention design, because the design processes of our interventions and programs have a history of being very exclusive. So at this stage, what we'll do when you're working in community-led data analysis is you're seeking to redistribute this analytical authority and valuing the diverse ways of knowing with the community at the center of it all. So this allows us not to extract knowledge, but rather to generate knowledge with community-centered insights. And the community themselves can make sense of what is actually meaningful to them. And when you have this, when you involve the community in the data interpretation and meaning-making process, then you're able to leverage multiple perspectives. You have the diverse voices of the community, their thought processes, and it helps you to understand how they're interpreting the realities on the ground. Additionally, the communities will also provide collective buy-in, in that they will also feel a deeper connection to the programs or interventions goals and the outcomes that you're looking to bring to them, which then they're more likely to support, they're more likely to invest in these outcomes and sustain the project interventions. And also when involving the community, we have increased data accuracy because the community members can help identify the inconsistencies or the gaps in the data, and they're able to reflect their own realities on the ground. And once that is done, then they're able to have ownership of the conclusions, which means they will sustain these interventions in a manner that is actually meaningful to them. Now, that is the what of community-led data analysis. So what is the how? How do we actually undertake community-led data analysis? How do we involve communities and all members of the community in the data analysis process? So as mentioned, community-led data analysis is an approach to qualitative data analysis with participatory principles. And so how it's conducted and the steps involved is largely influenced by the qualitative data analysis design. And in a typical qualitative data analysis, there are steps that are involved. First, you have to manage your data. And here you create and you organize the data. You bring in all the collected data that you have from surveys, from focus group discussions, from videos, photos, and etc. And then you review and familiarize, where you make initial notes and what you call the codes, and so that you can determine what is it that you're seeing from this data at a first glance. And then you classify. And this means now you group the data. For example, if you have a project on insecurity, you can have now broader themes that you're looking at, such as economic barriers to employment, for example. And after you've classified, then you move on to the interpretation, where you now make sense of the findings, and then moving on to validate your findings, and then proceed to share your results in reports or in a manner that befits you. So you'll find that these steps are presented differently across various literature. But the main idea is that you are connecting these steps and applying it in a community-led way. And the main essence is that they capture that we need to deconstruct this data. You're breaking it down together with the community, you're interpreting it and making sense of the findings with the community, and you're reconstructing it to create new knowledge with the community at the center. Because when it comes to community-led data analysis, it involves collective thinking. It involves collective thinking in its reflection of the data. You will have dialogue and have discussion on different experiences and stories with these community members. And then you move to generate insights as well. And here you collaboratively or together with the communities reflect on the data. And once you have that, then you can establish a hypothesis to create this new knowledge and generate new ideas, depending on the context of your project, that then allows you to move to the action that is needed in the context of your intervention or your design. So to put this into context and to actually break down the steps so that it can be easier for you to grasp how to actually undertake it, you'll find that the process has several steps listed differently across different literature. But the idea is that they guide you into fully engaging the community. And before you can see that there are 7 steps here. You may say this is tedious and long. But what we do at this stage is that we like to equate it to the cooking method. So for example, when you're cooking, you have the before the cooking, during the cooking, and after the cooking. So before cooking, you gather your ingredients, you decide what you want to cook. Then you do the cooking. During the cooking, you choose the method that you want to have. And that is whether you're boiling, you're frying, you're baking. And then after the cooking, you're eating and you're washing your dishes. So when you're looking at the steps in a community-led data analysis process, it borrows the same framework in that you have the before you conduct the analysis and the interpretation with your community, then during the analysis and the interpretation with your community, and then after the analysis and the interpretation done with the community. What do you do in all these 3 phases? So before the analysis and the interpretation, you have the first step, which is the preparation and the planning. So here you have to first define the purpose and the objectives of your data analysis, because they need to know, why are we doing this analysis? How will it benefit us? And you have to ensure that as you're explaining it to them, it aligns with their values, aligns with their priorities. And also when you're doing the preparation, you have to engage the stakeholders. First, you have to identify which members of the community am I going to work with. If it's a project on insecurity, again, you know that you will collect data from law enforcement institutions. You collect data from which type of demographic. Is it the youth? Is it the old? And then you collaborate with them to build trust. At this stage of preparation and planning, just as you're also, when you're cooking, you have to have your resources and the ingredients. Is the same situation here, the same scenario. You have to determine the resources that you need, which is your time. How much time will I take to engage with these community members? Do I have the expertise? Do I have people who will be able to engage with them in a manner that makes sense to them? Do I have the materials, depending on the context of your project? So at this stage, you're familiarizing them to the analysis process. You're introducing them to the data collection and explaining the relevance of this scenario. And then you move on
Joy?
to the due. Sorry?
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're gonna just, if you don't mind pausing for 1 minute, we're just transitioning the French interpretation to a new translator. So
All
just give
right.
1 minute. Sorry about that. And thank you everyone for your patience. And Paul, if you're still there. Let's see.
And while we figure out the interpretation and get it set up again, please feel free to reflect on everything that's you've heard so far, based on what Joy has said, or anything earlier, any reflections, any thoughts you have. This would be a good time to just put them in chat or even raise your hand and, share them. We've also had way more speaking in this call than we traditionally do, with me doing the whole overview. So this is a good place for us to pause.
Also, if Paul's replacement is on the call, if you could just let us know. We will add you to the interpretation. Pascal, do you mind coming in and just saying in French that we're taking 2 minutes to make sure we have French translation?
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Nous allons prendre 2 minutes pour nous assurer que la traduction en français est correctement faite. C'est pour ça que nous avons une.
And Pascal, maybe you can also just ask, okay. Do we have Achille here? I see your name. I believe, if you don't mind coming off mute just to confirm that we can make you the translator. Achille? I see you're here. And in the meantime, to Annette's question, who is the presentation directed to? Community-led practitioners or traditional international affairs players? I think these
Hello,
are.
madam.
Yes.
Sure. I'm in.
Hi, Achille. Are you ready to continue the translation in French?
Yes, madam. Yes.
Wonderful. I will make you an interpreter now.
Okay.
Hold on
Okay.
1 second. All right, great. You should be able to do that. Achille, are you there?
Oh, that's not set up.
I've made him the interpreter.
Yes, he's fine. I hear him in the French channel. So thank you, Achille. We are going to continue now, and you can carry on the interpretation in French, and our colleagues, Francophone colleagues, will be able to have access. Joy, before you continue, just pointing out, there is an important question that Colleen has also put in chat around confidentiality, which maybe you can touch on later. And that we'll come back to your question. It is an important question. I think it's not just about this presentation. It's essentially about who Unlearning Labs is geared towards. but we did interrupt Joy in the middle of the step process, so we'll let her complete that first. Thank you, Joy. And over to you.
And thank you,
All
Ashila.
right. Okay, thank you. So we were discussing these steps and we were talking about the preparation and planning and moving on to when you're undertaking the analysis and interpretation. The second step involves facilitating dialogue. So when you're facilitating dialogue during the interpretation, you have to create a safe space. For example, you have to decide in this community, are there forums or centers where they can feel safe?
Sorry,
share their-
Joyce. Sorry, Joyce. I think the interpretation was set up incorrectly. So we are hearing
Okay.
French in the English channel, and you on the French channel. So just give us 1 sec.
Okay.
Nelly?
Sorry about that. I was muted. People in the Spanish channel can hear Luana correctly, correct? Right?
Yeah, it's just the English and French that needs to change. We have that
Yeah.
other way
I'll
around.
try to reset him up as.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 second.
Apologies, everyone. As we said, our colleague, the Sarah, who manages all of this, is out today. And so we are trying to figure out stuff we haven't had to do before or in a long time. So please bear with us.
I've reset it up. Hopefully this this works. Thank you, Colleen, for pointing that out, and let us know if it isn't fixed.
So we'll do a quick test. Joyce, why don't you say something? I'll check the French, Nelly check the English, and we'll see if we have it set up as needed.
And
So
Ashil, please go ahead and keep translating. Thank you so much.
All right. So we are looking at the phases of during the interpretation, how we facilitate dialogue and having collective interpretation. I don't know if now they can hear me in English better.
I hear you in the English channel.
but the French is not going on, so we don't hear Ashil. Ashil, can you say something, please? Okay, I hear him in French. Did you hear him in English?
No.
Thanks, Ashil. That's great. So I could hear Ashil in French. If you didn't hear him in English, we are good to go.
Okay, then we should be good to go. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
All right. So once you facilitate dialogue, then you can move on towards the collective interpretation. And during the interpretation now is where you can facilitate small group discussions with the community, and they can discuss the data insights that you have presented to them from the data you have collected. So each, you can have small groups that focus on different aspects, such as if you have, I like to relate to the project again, example of insecurity. You may have a group focusing on youth violence or another on property crime. And here the goal is to encourage the participants to relate their data findings to their real life experiences. And then you guide them to identify key themes that are emerging from this data that they're seeking to interpret as they share their stories, as they share their findings. Again, at this stage of collective interpretation is to understand that disagreements are likely to occur because we have people with different perspectives. We have to create a space for respectful disagreement and exploration of differing interpretations. So after that is when you move now to refining these insights that you have gathered during the interpretation. At this stage of refining insights, you validate the findings that you have by presenting the initial insights back to the community for feedback. Now, what this means is during the collective interpretation, you will have unearthed some themes together with them. You will see some themes that you will identify, you will classify together with the community in the context of your program or project or research. So you come back together with them and you encourage deeper analysis so that you can explore root causes and implications and potential solutions. So here you're seeking to, you're asking essentially some questions. What is something that we have missed during the interpretation? What needs further analysis? What theme that we have identified during the interpretation needs deeper analysis? And you can also at this stage integrate new data. For example, if new incidents have occurred, you can factor them this new data during these discussions. And the aim is to aim for consensus on the main findings. That is ensuring that your community, they all have a unison voice in these things that they identify. After that, you can then facilitate having actionable recommendations from the insights that you have further refined in step 4. With this means you facilitate more discussions with the community where they can propose their own solutions. For example, again, in a project on insecurity, they can have a solution on having community patrols. So that is something that they have prioritized on their own, which is the main agenda towards community-led data analysis, that they themselves, from the themes that they will have seen, from the issues that will arise, that they can be able to propose their own solutions. And at this stage, you enable them or you help them to identify which actions to prioritize, depending on the resources available, of course. And you can define who will take on specific tasks. And the idea here is also to encourage long-term thinking for sustainability, so that the solutions that they offer can be sustained beyond the project or the program. You also have to create the next step, channel for feedback. Because throughout this whole process, throughout these whole steps, you have to document every story that they share during the interpretation, when you refine insights. So and then the recommendations, you have to document it in a report or whichever manner you deem fit, which they can all access. And with that, you can create channels for ongoing feedback, such as regular community meetings. So this spills over to the next step on reflecting and adapting, because you can facilitate them to have periodic reflection sessions. For example, quarterly sessions to discuss what has improved, what needs more work, if certain solutions are not working, how they can be open to modify them based on the feedback, and also to capture lessons learned from the processes to inform future initiatives also for your programs and projects. For example, if you see that with them, the community patrols have improved the safety, this is an example again in the project on insecurity, then it can also inform you to replicate it in another neighborhood, for example, but that depends on the context of your projects. So that is just but a step. And to mention, I will walk you through a case study so you can see how we applied these steps practically. So with these steps in mind, there are several methods that you can choose to undertake community-led data analysis. Again, as I mentioned before, the community-led data analysis is an approach towards qualitative data analysis. And so it borrows the methods of qualitative data analysis. And there are several methods, some that I have not included here, and some that are probably being developed right now. But some of them include participatory mapping, outcome mapping, most significant change, outcome harvesting. And these methods, they all have various angles they focus on. For example, if you want to capture the most significant changes as witnessed by the community, then you can use the most significant change method. If you want to capture intended and unintended outcomes, you can use outcome harvesting. So you can use which method you want, depending on the context of your program. these methods, each of them have their own steps, their own principles of how they follow. And so it will take us a long time to analyze them here today, but I invite you to look at them at your own time because we cannot cover all of them in this session. So regardless of which method you choose, you have to bear in mind that these methods are influenced by various factors, depending on the context of your program. For example, the nature of your data collected will influence the method you choose. If you have spatial data or you're dealing with imagery and GIS data, for example, it will be better to use participatory mapping, where you work with them to look at these images, these maps together with the communities. Or if you have, if you're looking towards looking at the intended and unintended outcomes and how outcomes are interconnected, then you can use outcome harvesting. It can also be influenced by timing and resources, because for these methods, some of them, they take a long time to prepare for them early on, because someone may have deeper steps which you don't have time, depending on your project. So the method you choose has all these influences and much more than this that I have listed here, including stakeholder and literacy levels, data sensitivity, physical environment, scale of the project. All of this, they influence the method that you choose. But again, I will invite you, when it comes to the methods of this community-led data analysis, to take a look at them at your own time, because we are short of time in this session. So at this stage, I would like to hear your voices again. I think Nelly had mentioned that there are questions in the group, but also to pose back a quick question to you. Into what challenges do you think you might face in your organizations as you're working with communities? What challenges do you think you might face when you're working with them towards in the analysis and interpretation of data? Because again, as mentioned, you're working with different communities with different contexts, different perspectives that they have. So many issues are likely to occur, but I would like to hear from you. What do you think are some of the challenges that you could face when you're engaging communities in the data analysis process? Anyone can share.
And Joy, as we wait for people to come in, just a couple of quick things. I remember that the first time I got into MEL by accident. I really had no background in monitoring and evaluation till I came to MCLD. And I remember when I used to first hear all of these terms that we are hearing here, from ripple effect mapping to outcome harvesting to, the different statistical analysis methods, I used to feel very overwhelmed, thinking there is no way I can do it. This is very technical. And one of the things in the last 5 years, as I've gone and delved into each of those methods, that I've realized is actually they are just logical. If you need to find a set of answers, if you have a set of questions and are looking for answers from a group of people and you have certain tools with you, like you have a camera or you have something else, then in most cases, the logical way you would think about using them to get to your answers is what most of those methods are. And I'm saying this because I know we have a mixed group here. And if anybody like me starting to feel a little overwhelmed when you hear all of these terminologies, it is to say that, just focus on the questions and the logic and don't worry about terminology now. Because as you become more confident with the process of it, with the how of it, then we can always go back to refer to these methods to see, okay, so what is the technical name for what we are doing? But I just wanted to put that out there because I know I used to feel very overwhelmed. I still do many times. So. And then the other thing that I did want to bring up was this whole question. I don't know if anybody else has this question, but oftentimes I wonder that can we only do qualitative data collection and analysis with the community, right? And the answer is no, actually. Because while it is true that quantitative data analysis requires, in some cases, statistical analysis or other things which may not be possible with the community, without some sort of capacity strengthening with them, it is also true that we have tools available that enable the communities to do that. And there are examples of communities doing it. So the important question in each one of these processes is to think about, well, Joy described so many steps to the process of data analysis itself. What is the role of the CLD practitioner, right? Whoever they are, from a CBO, from an NGO, whoever they are, what is the role of the CLD practitioner in this, in supporting the community? And what is the role of the community leaders in this? So it is possible to do quantitative data analysis with the community, but again, it just requires working with communities to see what are the roles which are best suited for community members and what are the roles which are best suited for practitioners, and how do we work together and walk together on this. Okay, I'll pause there so that we can actually have people responding to these questions.
And I would just put out there that I think, Colleen, actually, your question that you put in the chat speaks to this discussion point on the challenges. You asked about how to deal with confidentiality when having the community work together to interpret and analyze the data. And I think that that's a really good example of a challenge that might be faced. I don't know, Joy, if you have any thoughts on that. I'm also curious to hear what happens if, you know, how do you deal with disagreement that might come up in this process of people who are resistant to the results or to the results of the analysis, or might disagree on the meaning of it? And maybe actually we'll just collect a couple of these because I see Mohammed has his hand raised. If you want to go ahead, Mohammed.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so just to throw a little a light on the question that Joyce just asked, what are the challenges you face when doing data analysis with communities? You know, there are numerous challenges in doing data analysis with communities because one I can say is more like data quality and consistency. But you know, in as much as you are working with community, we have different. The community have their own timeline there that they have their normal activity to do, and you too have your timeline to actually collect and analyze your data. So there are a lot of challenges when it comes to data quality because of these time challenges as community members want to meet their own timeline to do their personal activities, and you too have to meet your own timeline in doing your analysis. And most times, like I say, we do have also some, how can I say, limited community engagement because of the numerous cultural differences or numerous language barriers. Beginning of your data process, even before your data analysis process, what you plan to do with the data, and even you collect them because for community level, like for example, for us at one village, we actually do a picture-based data, picture-based monitoring, collecting data based on the picture-based training that we give them. So this is one of the process. Even after involving them, you doing the analysis, they don't understand how you are doing this analysis. You have to take time explaining this to them. So language barrier and the limited community engagement also is a very big challenge in doing data analysis with communities. And it is sometimes time.
Thank you, Mohammed. So, Joy, also you can speak to that, but just to, I think part of the questions there is, you know, when you're in a limited time process, how do you deal with making sure that it's clear, communicated, there's different languages, there's all of these different things that are sort of other steps that you have to integrate to make sure that people can really participate fully in the process, and how to make space for that. Is that a good summary of what you were bringing up, Mohammed?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, great.
That is a good summary of what I was explaining.
And we'd
Yeah.
love to hear also from people if they have,
involving the community.
yeah, involving the community. We'd love to hear from people also on their own ways of addressing some of these challenges in terms of dealing with disagreement, making enough time and space for real engagement with the community and making it accessible, as well as dealing with confidentiality. And Arthur, I think you were trying to come in as well.
Yeah, yes. Good afternoon.
Please go ahead if you have anything you'd like to bring into the conversation.
Yes, it's just a short one that has to do with thank you first of all for your presentation. Mine has to do with the validation. How do we manage the validation of possibly the final data of what you might have collected to in order to ensure the full participation and the ownership of these views from the community. The validation process. How does it look like when it comes to prioritizing the needs of these community people or whatever intervention that you are designing? You want them to strongly own those processes and looking at the data. How do you manage it? How do you ensure? Like for example, when you are conducting program, you are conducting a quantitative, a qualitative programming, you most times want to ensure that all what you have gathered are in the consent of these people and they will acknowledge the beneficiaries. And then in such process, that's for program development. But for data collection, how do you manage those ones to ensure that they take ownership of the validation process eventually?
Thank you so much, Arthur. These are, and Luana has also added in some questions on how do we create a common view? Do we even want that? And wouldn't it make it too simple and not representative of the diversity and complexity? Yeah, that connects to the question that I brought up of, you know, what do you do when there's different interpretations or there's disagreement on how to interpret and analyze the data? I'm actually going to put a question to the group because this call has been a little logistically challenging. We're quite over time. And these are really great questions that people are bringing up that really get to, I think, the meat of it. Our plan has been to go through a case study and then go into breakout rooms, and put ourselves in the shoes of the community and think about how we would go through this process. I'm curious if anyone on the call has feelings on whether you'd like to sort of not answer these questions now or not think about these questions now and instead share them by email, and instead go to those case studies and breakout rooms, or if we'd like to actually stay here and spend time on these questions that people have brought up. If anyone has a feeling on that, I would love to hear
And Nelly, can I just add that if we are deciding not to do these questions now and we are saying email, it doesn't mean we don't address them. It just means that maybe one of the unlearning labs is all about these questions of confidentiality, of common view, of these different issues that are being raised because they may be useful across the board. But then as Colleen said, it's really possible that it doesn't make sense to think of the case study work that we were planning to do in breakout groups till we can answer some of these fundamental questions. So either way is fine. And it seems like we at least have, Nelly, one view saying that let's try and answer these questions here.
Yep.
And we don't come with answers, but we are hoping that within the expertise in this room, we can find answers or ways to get to those answers.
Colleen, go ahead. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could maybe add one more question in there. And it's not maybe we don't have an answer, but I try to anticipate because I come at this from encouraging programs that are working towards a more CLD approach to try to think about that in all the dimensions. And so I can, in addition to the confidentiality issue, which is one of the barriers I anticipate, right? A lot of, especially coming from things that are looking at programming related to gender and protecting people's identities as we analyze answers. The other barrier that I anticipate, and I'm curious if anyone has this, is once that norm is created with communities to work through data this way, I would feel like as a community member, I expect that now for all the things, right? That it's like once being, so I was wondering if anyone has had experience on starting to introduce this while still running other more traditional programming that has room to improve, as well as can you work through this type of participatory analysis even in a program where the theory of change and the center of it didn't come through the whole process, right? Is a phased approach to get yourself there possible, or does anybody have experience with that? And I hope I didn't make it harder, but that's what I'm noodling on today.
Not harder at all, Colleen. Thank you for raising that question. Yeah, we would, as Gunjan said, we'd love to hear from people. Have others on the call done this with the communities they work with? And what have some of the experiences been? I saw that Joanna also made a note in here. I don't know if you want to go off mute, Joanna, and share. Otherwise, I can read your comment. Joanna said that resentment from the community, particularly when the issues being analyzed don't resonate with community priorities. That's also a good point. Like, and I think I would love to hear from Joy and others about how I imagine it's very important to have been working with the community in this process the whole time up to now, so that those the priorities and the questions and the data are that the communities have been involved in all of that and feel some ownership there. But Joanna, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nelly. Greetings to everyone. For me, I feel that there would be resentment from the community, especially if the issues that are being analyzed are not really resonating with their priorities. I don't have that much experiences to share because CoMEL is something we haven't really put into practice. We are really getting to practice it now. So probably by the mid-year, next year, 2025, we will have more of those experiences to share. Yeah, back to you, Nelly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Why don't we, I think if it's okay with everyone, I think we'll stick with these questions for a little bit.
Yes, reduced by
Yeah, Aya,
Melak.
go ahead. Go ahead, Aya.
Yes, thank you very much. Like Joanna said, we used to have money monitoring and evaluation. It was not CoMEL. So another jargon has been added. So on top of that, what Joanna said is like it's already a new phenomenon that it has to take time to be understood by the community, people themselves, and even we, the actors, some of us that are civil society advocates for the communities and development agents. So because of that, we need to think about that, you know. So we need more trainings and more job practice that can help us to cascade the ideas throughout in our programmings and our projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aya. And we have Consolata and then Francis.
Hi, so I'm speaking from the Hunger Project. With the Hunger Project, we have what we call the animators in our epicenters. And the animators are formed based on the sectors that we operate, like health, education, and we also have the M&E animators. These animators normally are taken through the project indicators before the implementation of the project. So they are aware that these are the indicators we are going to be looking out for. They form the representatives of the community. And so during the implementation of the project, they are able to also track along with us. Now, when we are done and we do the end line evaluation, we do it with these M&E animators, co-opting other animators into the data collection. And after we have collected the data and analyzed it, we go back to the community to share the findings. And the community members are allowed to actually share whether some of the findings we have found are true reflection of what is on the ground or not. In fact, when we are doing these sharings, we invite our decentralized departments, that is the government sector departments that we work with. So they are also part of it because they also work in the communities. So we share the results with all of them. And then they are allowed to give their inputs on it before we give our final report. That's the experience I have from the Hunger Project Ghana.
Thank you so much, Consolata. So the M&E animators are community members themselves as well, is that right?
Yes, they are community members.
Yeah, that's I love that. That's also another model of community-led mail. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Sorry, the voice sounds like not for Francis. I'm attending with Francis Oyat, one of the staff for Family Harvest Foundation. And what I wanted to say with that experience, apart besides the nutrition projects that we've implemented in Noya district in Uganda, we've had
Oh, we lost you. You cut out there for a moment.
Hello?
Yep, you're back now.
Thank you. Yes, I was saying that besides the nutrition project we've implemented, we have experience with implementing a social norm change program where we've used, personally, I've used a community engagement approach that is called a community action cycle, where right from prioritizing issues that have to be addressed, it's engagement with the community. Yes, we've engaged the community members. What is it when it comes to social change, because people are talking about GBV that is being caused by attitudes, caused by the different cultural practices.
I am
But what
so
is it
sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm going to ask you to pause for 1 second because I think the French interpretation has gone. I just saw a message in chat. Just give us 1 second.
I think Achille, it looks like he got cut off.
Oh,
So he's dropped. Pascal, I don't know if you would be able to, we can
summarize.
summarize, and then if you could translate the summary at the end. And maybe, Pascal, you could just let the French speakers know now that that we'll do that, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. Go ahead.
Do you want to just say in French now that we'll summarize, and we're sorry that we lost the French translation?
I will read that at the end. Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Please keep going. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you. So as talking about engaging communities to prioritize issues that cause gender-based violence, coming from the aspects of social norms, aspects of cultural practices, and my experience is at prioritizing level, yes, we engage what we call the community gatekeepers, the community leaders, but also groups. You find that there are challenges around the gatekeepers influencing the community members on what actually to prioritize. And for example, the politicians coming in and saying, okay, let's prioritize probably a certain aspect, maybe we prioritize issues around maybe men beating their wives because the wives are participating in an economic activity, and because they are targeting voters, yes, when the time comes, yes, this is me who, worked through this project and was able to help you, contribute to the reduction in this and this and that. So those are some of the challenges where even when you're engaging community members, they are represented. You may not be able to engage every individual community person. And those representatives, sometimes, even when well empowered, there are other influences that affect their attitudes or affect their expectations in terms of what is it that the community can prioritize. And you go ahead, you collect data on such an issue, you get recommendations. If a recommendation is to do a project or to do an intervention, then you realize at the end of it all that at a time you're doing the intervention, it's not an issue because a politician or because a certain gatekeeper has actually misled the community members if you depend on the gatekeepers. So there are those challenges of depending on the community leaders while the actual community affected persons, they yes believe in them because there is an aspect of illiteracy, ignorance. They believe in them. Yes, this one is able to represent us, but when they are being misrepresented. Thank you. I'm Pauline, attending together with Francis, Family Abuse Foundation, Uganda.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Before we hand it back actually to just hear a little bit from Joy from some of these questions, and there's more comments that are coming in the chat, so we will go back to those from Annette and Pascal and others. But Gunjan, maybe if you want to just summarize that really quickly.
Sure, so that Pascal can then translate to French. So if I understood correctly, and please, Pauline, let me know if I've missed anything, but Pauline raised the very important point of, well, communities are not monoliths, right? And there are power differentials that exist within communities. So when you are doing community-led, any aspect of CoMEL, data analysis, data collection, questions, and all of that, typically, we tend to go to community leaders or the gatekeepers because that's an easy access point. However, the views may not always be representative of all of the community, right? So how do we make sure that in doing this process, we are not exacerbating, right? We are not increasing the power differentials in a community, because that can be one of the unintended consequences if we are not doing this correctly. So if I understood correctly, that's what Pauline was pointing to, the fact that communities are not homogeneous, they are power differentials. And how do we, in this process, make sure that we are conscious of this and we are not missing out huge parts of information because of who we are speaking to. And I think, Nelly, that spoke to the earlier point that you had raised, and in a sense, Luana brought up again, right? About diversity of voices and opinions. How do we make sure we get them? And how do we make sure that one is not steamrolling others, right? The
Exactly.
perspectives. So we'll let Pascal, sorry, hope you can translate that.
And I know we actually have Achille back on with us. I don't know if that translated into French.
Yeah.
So it already went through in French. We don't need to do the summary.
Yes, I translate
Okay.
the last part mentioned by Gunjan, and could come
Perfect.
again for, yeah. Okay, thank you. Oui, la question que nous étions en train de discuter, c'est quels sont les défis que nous pourrions avoir pour faire l'exercice que nous voulons. Quels sont les défis auxquels vous pouvez être confrontés lors de l'analyse des données avec les communautés? La question. Les deux points importants que John venait de mentionner en résumé, c'est que la communauté n'est pas une composante unique. Il y a des leaders, il y a des hommes politiques. Et généralement, lorsque nous allons au niveau des communautés, nous allons directement au niveau de ces leaders-là. Mais comment, en faisant cette démarche, nous allons nous rassurer que nous ne privilégions pas la voix des leaders, de ceux qui influencent les communautés ou les politiques, au détriment de la voix des communautés. Ça, c'est un défi que nous devons vraiment être attentifs. Nous devons être attentifs à ce défi et voir comment on le relève. Dans la même veine, il y a une diversité de voix et d'opinions au sein des communautés. Comment nous nous assurons qu'il y a une opinion, il n'y a pas une voix, il n'y a pas des composantes de la communauté qui dominent. Donc, ça reflète un peu le point essentiel que nous avons vu ci-dessus. Donc, c'est deux points, mais je vais revenir après pour parler un peu de ce qui a été discuté avant. Thank you. Just translate to.
Thank you so much, Pascal. And hopefully we have Achille back so that we can keep having the simultaneous translation. So just let me know if you don't hear French translation. Joanna, I saw you had your hand up, but before we go back to you, I just want to return to Joy. I know there's been a lot of conversation, inputs, questions. So don't expect you to respond to all of it, but any thoughts at this point? Would be curious.
Thank you, Nelly, and thank you for all the questions that have been raised. I've not been able to capture all, but I think that one key aspect or issue that I've realized as these questions were being thrown out or being raised is that the diversity of voices has been one of the questions that have been raised. How do you diversify these voices in the community? How do we ensure that all the underrepresented groups are engaged, as well as how that speaks to answer to us involvement of everyone in the community? And I will point out that given that I've worked with many communities, and because my work line deals with peace and conflict projects, most of these projects, we work with communities who they feel unsafe in sharing most of their stories because they feel they.
So sorry. Achille, I see you are muted, so I don't hear you in the French channel. If you're able to unmute. Doesn't seem to be working. While he works on that, Pascal, I will just ask. Oh, here, you're unmuted. Ashil, can we hear you? Maybe Joy tried to say something in English and we'll see if we hear.
Should I go on or? Yeah.
Just checking if I hear Ashil. I don't hear him. Pascal, I will just ask you to just take some notes to translate after. We really appreciate just that Joy can keep going in the meantime. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So I was discussing, because I work with communities who there's no space for safe spaces for expression. Sometimes there's the aspect that not all community members will be included. Now, I recently worked on a similar project, and we found that most of the data reflected, as Gunjan has mentioned, they reflected the ideas only.
You're saying to be muted, you're not hearing anything.
You cannot hear me?
I think
if you can unmute to be better.
Are you looking for the French translation?
No.
We should be able to hear in English, and then Pascal will translate into French. I will also try to reset up the translation to make sure that Ashil can do it. In the meantime, Joy, go ahead.
Okay. I seem to have also lost my train of thought, but what I was focusing on was that in terms of involvement, the idea is initially to understand the community that you're going to work with, and also the objectives that you have. That is one of the key things that we have worked on with the different projects that we have undertaken. Because you've seen that sometimes the themes that are coming up from our first data collection processes are not representative of all the community members. And that has happened several times in our projects. And what we've done is that we have had to, when we are designing the project, when we know that this project is going to work with communities, we factor in that time length in knowing that we have to continuously go back to the community members again. What I mean by this is once you've collected the data and done the first analysis, and then with it you can see, okay, but this is from the community leaders. Then we have to hold other harvesting sessions. We have to, for example, in a recent project, we had to send targeted invites to specific members of the community because we're dealing in a region that was tackling safety issues after war issues. And so we had to be very careful with who we were targeting. We had to ensure that we are going to, not just the community leaders themselves, because they are the first point of interaction, yes, but we also wanted to go down and see what about the women, the youth, the elders, and understanding that this can take some time. So we had to build, you have to find ways to build that trust with the different marginalized communities, if I can use that word, marginalized members of the community. And you reach out to these groups personally and explain the importance of the unique perspectives. The beauty of that is we somehow had to get that one-on-one interaction with them, in that there was no space for them to feel that they cannot share their stories. But the downside of that also is that it takes some time. You cannot go to all of them one by one. But our idea was to counter, sort of validate. I think someone had raised that question on the validation, to counter and validate some of these themes that were shared to us, which we realized did not represent everyone in the community. So when it comes to issues of engagement and involvement, there's a lot to factor in. There's a lot to establish from the start, not during the analysis. That is one thing we realized. Because sometimes we've got that shortfall that we decide, okay, we're doing this collection and then we're involving them in the analysis, but we did not think beforehand, how are we going to do it? How are we going to target all members without it being exclusive? So there are some various techniques which, in the respect of time, and because I don't want to bring in some new jargon that might confuse people, but we had some consensus building exercises that have helped us identify a majority of views while respecting minority opinions. We have this method called the dot voting. So the participants or the community members, they vote on different interpretations. Or also another method where we call it the round robin, and each person shares their perspectives in turn. So such methods have allowed us to actually ensure that we can engage all community members rather, to ensure that all voices are heard. But it's definitely a challenge. It's definitely a challenge because you have to also factor in with the project that you're holding. And given for us that it's an international organization, we're able to sometimes work as the donor in aligning how we can space out this the time frame. But then we also have to understand for some organizations that are looking towards the donor, they have to still report back to the donor with a timeline and the money shared. There's a lot to consider at that. So there's a lot to say towards involving and engaging the community. It is different tasks that takes on majority of viewpoints and different perspectives. But at the heart of it all, one thing that we have worked on to make it very easy for us is to build this trust and relationships early with the community. Immediately we know we're going to start a project, is not waiting till the data collection. We have to understand this community that we are working in. And I think that's the beauty of the qualitative approach, because you can go and spend a lot of time with this community, you engage with them, and with that you can be able to know there exists this marginalized group. How can I be able to bring them in and share their viewpoints, share their perspectives? So when we have that building the trust and relationships early, we also are able to clarify the roles and benefits early on. It has allowed us really, from majority of the projects, to ensure that most of their voices are heard. But I think I will stop at that, because I think there's some more questions that are coming in, and the timing, yeah.
Thank you, Joy, so much. And yeah, we'll wrap up in a few minutes, but I know Pascal, Annette, Joanna have all either raised their hands or said things in the chat. So if any of you want to come and share, and yeah, Luana probably can't, but if anyone wants to share out loud, please do. And Gunjan, I think you had also a couple of stories that you were sharing in the chat, if you want to share them here. Joanna says, communities have not been and still are not active participants in development, but have been purely on the receiving end of what they need and don't need from interventions. It would be challenging to introduce the processes of CoMEL, but there are remedies that we can apply to ease the situation. I think that connects to a point that Gunjan put in the chat earlier, of saying that, having MEL processes that are entirely community-led, that we don't know how to do that yet, or that hasn't happened yet. And so this is about sort of aspiring and moving in that direction. But Joanna, maybe, or Gunjan, maybe you want to add to that. And then Joanna, if you want to come back in.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I'm not sure I have time to go into any examples, but I did want to take a couple of issues that have come here just from, so some of you may know, we have been actively, MCLD has been actively working for the last few years on a project on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and actually putting some of the ideas and thoughts into practice. And there have been some interesting batch of learnings. And that's why, Joanna, to the point you made and what Colleen said earlier also, one of the things we have realized is that if you are trying to bring in CoMEL processes into your program, which is top down, or in a situation where the community is not, used to CLD programming, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because not only is there the resentment that Joanna talked about and that Annette also spoke to, but there's also this point of, people don't know what you expect them to do because they have been told continuously that somebody is going to come and solve their problems for them. They don't know how to solve their problems. And now you're saying, well, tell us this. And they're like, but we don't know, right? So we've seen a lot of confusion coming in. I wanted to also very quickly just point to a very important point that Colleen raised, which I don't think we are going to be able to unpack today, but will be in subsequent conversations around confidentiality. And Annette raised the point around, how confidentiality norms are currently defined, again, outside. And I think it's a mix of the two. So there are situations, especially as Joy was talking about, very sensitive situations where communities are fractured, because we've often said that when we speak to community, we think of it as a monolith, but it's not. And communities are not homogeneous. And communities are constructs, things that we are talking about, the place-based communities. But people in those places don't necessarily think of themselves as one common community, right? And so there are challenges around confidentiality. There are challenges around issues of trust, around safety and security. And a lot of it is very context specific. But I feel like that's a whole session unto itself. But I did want to just bring that up because it is a very critical part of it, because do no harm has always been a very critical criteria for all of us in the work that we do. I'll pause there because I saw Joanna and Mohammed had hands.
And then we will wrap up as we're at time. Mohammed, is there anything you want to add?
I would have loved to actually share some little bit of how we do our CoMEL, but since we don't have time, I think we have presentation this month, so maybe we'll talk a lot on that.
Wonderful.
In one village, we'll be doing some presentation on and feedback data sharing this month. So we'll talk a lot on that, on how we do our community-led monitoring at One Village Partners.
Yes, you're giving us a preview of the call we'll have in a few weeks. Joanna, is there anything you want to add before we close out?
No, thank you, Nelly. I think I said what I wanted to say, but we can have this conversation further because it felt like we have been tickled to think further. So maybe if we are given extra time to think deeply ourselves, we can come up with better ideas and remedies to the situations. It felt like it was something that we didn't expect right now.
Yeah, I think that'd be, thank you, Joanna. And Joy did prepare a whole case study and breakout room exercises for all of us to put this into practice. So maybe we will try to find time to do that and to continue this conversation. I will close out in a minute with just a few reminders about upcoming calls, including the one that Mohammed referred to. But before I do, and before I give my thanks to all of you, I wanted to see, Joy, if you have anything that you'd like to say before we close the call.
Yeah, I think, as mentioned by I don't know who spoke, but she mentioned that it's a moment that has led you to provoke your thinking. because instead of just understanding how the steps are undertaken, there's a lot to unpack when you're dealing with communities. How do you ensure that you leave no one behind, which is the main element towards community-led data analysis? And how do you bring their differences that and ensure that there is collaborative or collective thinking among the community members? It's a lot to unpack. It's a process that it takes a lot of exercises to actually learn. It takes a lot of time to be able to understand how do you foster dialogue with different and diverse members in any type of community. So having these conversations, I think, will pick our thoughts and pick our interests, and perhaps we can have this call again so we can expound further on most of those questions, which we can have various answers to, and perhaps even point out some of the exercises that we have done in response to most of those questions that you have. But I think at the center of it all is understanding that the community is a complex, it's a very complex unit, because it's when involving them in the data analysis and the interpretation, there's a lot to think about, and it's not just a one-off. It's not just planning that you engage people. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of sensitivity around it that we need to learn how to respond to, and I hope that we will continue thinking further, and we can meet again to carry on this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. First, thank you for leading us. Thank you for your flexibility. Thank you to everybody on the call for your patience and flexibility while we managed some last-minute challenges that we weren't expecting. I wanted to put in the chat the link to the community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning CoMEL survey that we are doing, where we're collecting stories of how we all, everyone on this call and within our movement, does this kind of work. There's clearly, we heard so much today, there's clearly a lot of people on the call that are doing this. And I'm sure many more of us are, even if we don't always think about it. But as Joanna said, when we reflect, I think we'll discover that a lot of these processes we already carry in our work. So we would love if you could share some of those stories. I put the links to the survey in English, French, and Spanish into the chat. And then I also just wanted to highlight some of our calls that are coming before the end of the year. I'll also put them in the chat. I just realized I didn't send it to everyone. Sorry. Here's the links to the survey. So on November 20th, well, actually on November 26th, we will have the next Unlearning Lab call with Mohammed and One Village Partners in Sierra Leone, where they will share about how they do it, and we'll talk specifically around sharing back the data, the lessons, the analysis, and taking action on that, and how to have communities be leading in that part of the process as well. As we talked about today, communities should be engaged, participating, and leading in all of these steps where and how possible, including that one. We also will have a global call on November 20th, where we will look at shrinking civic space and strategies that all of us and members of the movement are taking to address shrinking civic space in our own countries. We will also then have a leadership development call on December 11th, looking at inclusive leadership and mitigating conflict in that kind of a situation. And our last call of the year will be on December 18th. It will be a global call where we will look back at everything that we've done over the year, which has been a tremendous amount, and we will look forward to next year. So with that, I will close it out. We're over time. And we so appreciate everybody's contributions, the really rich discussion. And thank you again to Joy, as well as to our interpreters, Luana, Achille, and Paul earlier, and Pascal. With that, we can end in the way that we always end for MCLD calls, where you can go off mute and say goodbye in your language, whatever language is your
Goodbye.
preferred. So,
Bye.
Biane.
Goodbye.
Bye, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye, bye.
Bye, bye.
Gracias.
Adiós, bye bye.
Adiós.
Adios.